In an entertainment industry where brilliance can be purchased with money, but presence can be stripped away by invisible forces, Yu Menglong is not merely a forgotten name. He is a reality being systematically erased. Is it possible that when a talented artist suddenly becomes a ghost on every search engine, it is no longer a coincidence, but rather the beginning of a silent yet brutal purge behind closed doors? You feel the weight of this terrifying silence. A like or a subscription at this moment is how we together maintain the link to the truth. Stand with me so that the name Yu Menglong never sinks into nothingness. In an industry where appearance is calculated by contracts and disappearance often requires no explanation, the name Yu Menglong once existed as a familiar part of the Chinese entertainment machinery. There was no noise, no public controversy, and no association with any officially confirmed scandal. And then, at an unannounced moment, that name gradually became difficult to find, difficult to mention, and difficult to display, as if he had never existed in the way the public once knew. The notable point does not lie in the fact that Yu Menglong disappeared. In the history of the entertainment industry, the absence of an artist is not a rare occurrence. What makes this story different is the way the silence has been maintained, synchronized and persistent to the point of creating a void too obvious to be considered accidental. There were no announcements, no denials, and no explanations sufficient to fill the questions that began to arise from the audience themselves. For many months, Yu Menglong became a suspended name. No one confirmed what had happened, yet no one explained why everything followed the same pattern whenever his name was mentioned. Search results changed. Certain posts vanished. Accounts once related to him became silent. Before the mainstream media spoke out, it was the public who were the first to realize that something did not fit. That silence might have continued to stretch on, were it not for a moment that seemed very small, yet created a crack in a structure considered airtight. In an internal exchange said to be routine, a senior executive in the industry raised a question directly related to the case of Yu Menglong. This was not done through the language of resistance or public declaration, but through a straightforward suspicion. This could not merely be a coincidence. That question did not appear in the official minutes. It did not become a newspaper headline. But it was heard, it was remembered, and in less than 48 hours afterward, the person who asked the question gradually disappeared from his key positions. There was no notice of dismissal. No reason was announced. There was only a quiet withdrawal, enough for the remaining people to understand that there are things that should not be touched. From that moment, the story no longer revolved only around Yu Menglong. It began to expand, spreading beyond the scope of an individual to touch upon a larger question. Why does protecting a colleague become a risky act? And why is silence, in this case, no longer viewed as neutral? What followed was not organized, had no leader, and did not take the form of familiar protest. But it was precisely from that prolonged silence that a collective response gradually formed. Silent yet persistent, enough to force the entire system to realize that there are stories which, once remembered, will not easily disappear. To understand why the name Yu Menglong could become a zone of prolonged silence, one must look at the context in which he existed. The Chinese entertainment industry is not just a creative space, it is an ecosystem operating through contracts, image constraints, and rules that are not always written down. There, a career depends not only on talent or a fan base, but is also tightly bound to the ability to maintain a state of being safe in the eyes of the system. Yu Menglong entered the industry with a relatively stable image. He was not a publicly controversial face, nor did he frequently appear in media confrontations. His presence for many years was steady and controlled. Therefore, when the first signs of absence appeared, they did not cause an immediate shock. A project was delayed. A schedule was no longer mentioned. These were small changes, enough to be viewed as ordinary internal adjustments. However, the difference lay in the way those adjustments were repeated. There was no official announcement saying Yu Menglong encountered personal problems. There was no explanation that he was pausing his activities. There was also no information confirming that his career was changing direction. Instead, there was a series of voids. Each individual void could be ignored, but when strung together, they formed a familiar pattern for those who had witnessed similar cases in the past. In this environment, silence is not simply a lack of information. It is a state maintained by tacit consensus. Platforms do not report news. Partners do not mention the name. Those who once collaborated choose to evade. This is not because there is a public order, but because everyone understands the limits of what should be said. Yu Menglong gradually became a topic that no one proactively mentioned, even though no one publicly denied his existence. It was in this context that the role of the senior executive became particularly important. This was not an outsider. He understood clearly how the system operated. He understood the boundary between what could be discussed and what should be left alone. In an internal exchange, where decisions are usually presented in technical and safe language, he chose to ask a question directly related to the case of Yu Menglong. This was not to advocate for an individual, but to clarify a series of events that were becoming increasingly difficult to explain. That question, according to what was passed down, was not confrontational. It did not accuse or speculate on motives, it merely pointed out the unusual overlap between the times Yu Menglong was mentioned and the silent reactions immediately following. In a system accustomed to ignoring blurred spots, the act of asking such a question was enough to be considered crossing the line. It did not break the rules, but it touched upon what many chose not to see. The reaction of the system was swift and precise. There was no dismissal notice, no public disciplinary measures. That executive simply no longer appeared in the positions that once belonged to him. Important meetings took place without his name on the list. Decision-making power was narrowed. His presence was blurred in the same way Yu Menglong had experienced. This was not a noisy punishment, but a professional suffocation in silence. This moment marked an important turning point. It showed that the story of Yu Menglong did not only involve an individual, but reflected how the system reacts when asked to explain. Removing the person who asked the question was not aimed at sending a public message, but at reinforcing a principle. There are issues that do not need to be clarified, and those who attempt to clarify them will place themselves in a zone of risk. However, it was precisely that precision and speed that created a reverse effect. For those observing from the outside, especially the audience familiar with information control patterns, the coincidence became too obvious. Yu Menglong was silent. His defender disappeared, and no explanation was provided. When the voids began to connect, the public no longer saw randomness, they saw a structure. At this stage, Yu Menglong had not yet become a symbol. He was still just an absent name. But it was that absence, surrounded by consistent reactions, that laid the foundation for what was about to happen. The question was no longer what Yu Menglong had done, but why mentioning him caused so many people to choose silence. And as that question began to spread beyond the internal scope, the system for the first time faced a challenge that could not be handled simply by erasing an individual's presence. The disappearance of the senior executive did not create an immediate storm. There was no wave of public outrage, no slogans, and no calls to assemble. The surface of the entertainment industry continued to operate as usual. Broadcast schedules continued to be announced. Promotional campaigns still took place on time. But beneath that veneer of stability, another process was beginning to take shape, slower and more difficult to perceive. For the public, especially those accustomed to following the behind-the-scenes of the entertainment industry, the overlap became an element that could not be ignored. Yu Menglong disappeared from official channels. The only person who asked questions about him also disappeared in the same way. There was no new information, yet there were too many identical signs. In an environment where information is often truncated, the voids themselves became data. The first reactions were not collective. They appeared sporadically in the form of small questions in comment sections, personal posts, and individual exchanges. Does anyone realize this? Why is everything repeating like this? And these questions were not aimed at asserting anything, but merely recorded a common feeling. Something did not fit. It was precisely that reserved nature that helped them survive long enough to be seen by others. When mainstream platforms failed to provide an explanation, the public began to construct a timeline themselves. Old interviews of Yu Menglong were rediscovered. Partnership announcements that once existed and then vanished were archived. Timelines related to the senior executive were placed side by side. There was no single piece of evidence strong enough to conclude, but when placed together, they formed a familiar pattern for those who had witnessed similar cases in the past. At this stage, the public reaction was still observational. There was no clear polarization. One segment argued that this was just a coincidence or the result of internal adjustments that outsiders did not need to know. Another segment believed that the consistency of the silent reactions was too obvious to be ignored. The important thing was that both streams of opinion coexisted, and it was that very existence that prevented the story from being framed in a single conclusion. The transition occurred when the silent actions began to have specific consequences. Several projects indirectly related to Yu Menglong were delayed without a public reason. Some brands adjusted their media content to avoid mentioning elements that could be related. These changes were not large enough to become news, but frequent enough to create a feeling that the entire system was self-adjusting in the same direction. From here, public behavior began to change. Not through words, but through choices. Some audience members proactively avoided consuming products related to entities believed to benefit from the silence. There was no official list, no call for a boycott. There were only individual decisions repeated over and over based on the same memory being shared covertly. Each individual decision was insignificant, but when added together, they began to create signals that the system could not ignore. Notably, this reaction spread beyond the original borders. When information was restricted domestically, external communities began to translate what remained. Analytical articles appeared on international platforms, not mentioning Yu Menglong directly, but clearly hinting at the pattern taking place. The more it was compressed in one place, the further the story echoed elsewhere. This meant that domestic silence was no longer sufficient to control how the story was understood outside. Yu Menglong during this period gradually shifted his position in the public perception. He was no longer just an absent artist. He became a reference point. Every time a new project was delayed without explanation, people remembered his case. Every time another name suddenly vanished from the media, the memory of Yu Menglong was summoned, even without his name being mentioned. His presence shifted from the physical to the symbolic. The system, accustomed to handling crises by slowing down the pace of public opinion, began to encounter difficulties with this form of reaction. There was no climax to extinguish. There was no leader to negotiate with. There were no demands to meet. Instead, there was a state of prolonged observation where every action of the system was remembered and compared with the past. In that context, every decision to remain silent was no longer neutral. It became a new signal for the public to interpret. It was here that a truly decentralized boycott formed. It did not explode, it accumulated. It did not rely on immediate emotion, it relied on long-term memory. The public no longer asked what happened to Yu Menglong, but asked, why are stories like this always handled in the same way? That question, once asked enough times, began to move beyond the scope of an individual and touched upon how the entire system operates. Yu Menglong did not appear to say anything. The senior executive did not return to explain. But their absence no longer weakened the story. On the contrary, it made the story exist in a different form, more persistent and harder to control. As the public shifted from reaction to remembering and from consumption to choice, the balance of power began to shift in a way that required no noise. The darkest stage of the story did not come from an explosive event, but from prolongation. There were no announcements. There were no denials. There were no explanations provided, even when the unusual signs had exceeded the scope of personal speculation. Yu Menglong remained absent. The senior executive still did not return. And the system, instead of responding, chose to continue moving as if nothing needed to be clarified. It was precisely that prolongation that changed the nature of the crisis. If, in the early stage, the story revolved around the question, "What happened?" at this point, the focus had shifted to, "Why is there no answer?" Every day that passed without a response no longer helped reduce pressure. Instead, it accumulated more suspicion. In an environment where every message is meticulously calculated, prolonged silence became the clearest message of all. Consequences began to appear in elusive ways. It was not a sudden collapse, but small yet continuous changes. A brand that had once collaborated closely adjusted its media strategy. A project considered safe was unexpectedly delayed for further review. Some international partners chose to keep their distance, not through a declaration, but by simply not continuing. No one said these decisions were directly related to Yu Menglong, but no one denied that the overall context had changed. For the system, this was the most awkward time. Responding directly meant admitting that there was something needing explanation. Continuing to remain silent meant accepting that every subsequent action would be placed under the lens of collective memory. There was no truly safe choice left. Every familiar reflex, once effective in the past, now carried risk. Yu Menglong, throughout this period, still did not appear to tell his own story. He offered no explanation, nor did he refute the speculations that were spreading. But it was precisely that absence that highlighted his new role in the public perception. He was no longer viewed as an individual needing protection or attack. He became a landmark. A name that whenever the system chose silence, people unconsciously compared against. This transformation marked the climax of the story. The public no longer needed new information to maintain interest. They had a pattern to reference. Each time a similar situation appeared, even involving a different character, the first reflex was no longer to wait for an explanation, but to remember how the story was handled. Yu Menglong, in that way, became a reference standard for every silent crisis thereafter. Notably, this reaction did not lead to chaos. There was no new noisy wave of boycotts. No collective demand was issued. Instead, there was a state of prolonged vigilance. The public followed more closely. Consumer decisions became more cautious. Support was no longer a given, it became something to be weighed. It was precisely that silent change that was the factor forcing the system to adjust. At the internal level, according to what was passed down, the way of discussion also began to differ. The question was no longer, do we need to respond, but how will this silence be remembered? This was an important change. It showed that control of the story no longer resided entirely in the hands of the spokespeople, but had shifted to the way the public preserved and interpreted memory. Yu Menglong was not exonerated, nor was there any official evidence provided to conclude what had happened. But that was no longer the focus. In an environment where the truth is often delayed, the lack of a conclusion does not mean the story ends. On the contrary, it makes the story exist longer, in the form of a lesson that is not written but is always present. By this time, it can be said that the decentralized boycott had completed its role. Not by toppling an individual or forcing an organization to publicly admit a mistake, but by changing behavior. The system did not become ideally more transparent, but it became more cautious. And that caution did not stem from legal or media pressure, but from the fear of being remembered. Yu Menglong, in that way, left the story as a specific human being to exist as a concept. A reminder that silence is not always invisible, and that there are names which, though no longer appearing, continue to influence how decisions are made. When a system must change because of memory, it is a sign that power has begun to shift, albeit very slowly. And it was in that slow shift that the story of Yu Menglong reached its final point of enlightenment. Not because he was returned to his old position, but because his absence forced an entire industry to rethink the price of choosing silence. There was no clear concluding moment for this story. There was no press conference to close the suspicions. There was no official document confirming what had happened to Yu Menglong. Time continued to pass, new projects appeared, and other faces stepped into the spotlight. On the surface, the entertainment industry seemed to have returned to its familiar rhythm of operation. But beneath that flow, something had changed in an irreversible way. Yu Menglong did not return to reclaim his position. The senior executive did not appear to tell the story from the inside. Their absence was not compensated by any explanation. However, it was precisely that absence that became the answer the public remembered. It was not the answer for right or wrong, but for another, more important question. When a system chooses silence in the face of repeated suspicions, what will the public do with their attention? When the darkness of silence covers the name Yu Menglong, it does not extinguish the truth. On the contrary, it turns the memory of him into an invisible yardstick for conscience and justice. Is it possible that power is no longer confident that time will erase everything, now that every silence is interpreted by the public as a signal of things that cannot yet be named? The biggest lesson from this story lies not only in the fate of an individual, but in the silent shift in the relationship between the public and power. Gone are the days when silence was viewed as a safe choice to wait for attention to subside. After Yu Menglong, silence has become a type of data, evidence of an inconsistency that the collective memory never ignores. The system may not change immediately, but they have begun to know the fear of the power of remembering. Yu Menglong, at this endpoint, is no longer an absent artist. He has become an aching reference point in social memory, a reminder that there are stories which, even without an official announcement, are strong enough to shape how we perceive the world. The question for the future remains open. When the darkness repeats, will silence still be a solid wall, or will it collapse before a public that has learned how to observe through behavior? The answer perhaps lies not in declarations, but in the quiet yet unerring presence of a truth waiting to be acknowledged. The truth only truly lives when we refuse to forget. A like or a subscription at this time is how we together preserve a long-term archive of fairness. Please leave your thoughts in the comments, because it is your voice that is shaping how the system must respond in the future.